The world before 1914 was a fragile masterpiece, a glittering illusion of progress held together by colonial dominance, rapid industrialization, and uneasy alliances beneath the surface. Tensions simmered nationalism, imperial ambition, and militarism all whispered promises of conflict, waiting only for the right spark to ignite them. And that spark came on a summer morning in Sarajevo when Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist. The event rippled through Europe like a thunderclap, setting off a chain reaction of alliances, mobilizations, and declarations of war as the continent plunged into chaos. The English-speaking nations of the world watched with rising concern. Great Britain, still the centerpiece of a global empire, tried at first to maintain diplomatic calm, but when Germany invaded Belgium, violating its neutrality, Britain entered the war with a declaration that echoed across its dominions in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the far reaches of the empire. The call to arms was answered not just with duty, but with fervent loyalty to the crown in Canada. Young men lined up in cities like Montreal and Toronto, eager to join what they thought would be a short, victorious campaign in Australia. The enthusiasm was electric. The newly federated nation saw the war as a chance to assert itself on the global stage, and thousands volunteered within days. New Zealand matched that zeal, sending its sons to join the expeditionary forces destined for Europe and beyond across the ocean. The United States remained neutral, its President Woodrow Wilson walking a tightrope between pacifism and preparedness, but beneath the surface, American industry and public opinion were slowly shifting. War was not yet inevitable for America, but the tides were turning. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, the English soldiers joined their French allies in the grim trenches of northern France and Belgium, where the dreams of quick glory were soon buried under mud and blood and the thunder of constant shell fire. The First Battle of the Marne halted the German advance but ushered in a nightmarish stalemate. Soldiers from Canada and Newfoundland soon joined the British ranks at Ypres and the Somme, where their bravery earned respect and their sacrifices piled up in staggering numbers. The war quickly expanded beyond Europe, turning into a truly global conflict. English-speaking soldiers found themselves in Egypt, Mesopotamia, East Africa, and the Dardanelles, where the infamous Gallipoli campaign would etch itself into the soul of Australia and New Zealand. The Anzacs, as they were called, stormed the cliffs of the Gallipoli Peninsula in a campaign, doomed by poor planning and fierce Ottoman resistance. Yet their courage created legends that shaped national identities back home for the English-speaking nations. This war was more than a military endeavor. It was a test of unity, identity, and endurance for many colonial troops. It was also a chance to assert themselves as equals in the empire, contributing blood and effort to a conflict that would redefine the 20th century as the war entered its second year. The scale of suffering had only deepened, but the role of these nations was only beginning to take form in ways that would forever alter their place in history. The second year of the war turned the battlefield into a vast machinery of death and endurance. Trench warfare became the dominant form of combat, stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Miles of barbed wire artillery craters and rotting corpses carved a new kind of hell into the European soil. British forces, now heavily supported by Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand troops, found themselves facing wave after wave of German offensives. The Battle of Loos and the battles of the Somme in 1916 revealed the sheer brutality of modern mechanized warfare. Tanks were introduced by the British and machine guns ruled the front lines, while poison gas drifted in the air, choking thousands with silent death in the chaos of the Somme. Canadian divisions gained a fierce reputation for courage and resilience, pressing forward under heavy fire to capture Regina Trench and other strategic points, suffering enormous losses but never retreating. It was during this time that the young Dominion began forging a unique identity, no longer merely an offshoot of Britain, but a Nation forged in sacrifice across the Channel. Australian and New Zealand forces fought side by side with British units in France and Belgium, having survived the horrors of Gallipoli. These Anzac troops proved themselves again and again in places, like Fromelles and Pozières, where death was measured in inches gained and thousands lost. Every step forward felt like a national birth through blood. Meanwhile, back home, the war changed. Societies entirely. Women stepped into factories' offices, and farms replacing men gone to the front and proving their capability in a world once closed to them. The economies of Canada and Australia shifted rapidly towards total war, with increased production of munitions, uniforms, and medical supplies. Bolstering the Allied efforts, the press glorified the heroism of the troops, but letters from the front painted a grimmer picture of lice trench, foot-shattered nerves, and friends buried in shallow graves. The sense of purpose was strong, but so was the growing awareness that this was no short war and victory would not come easily in South Africa. The English-speaking minority contributed to the war effort, with volunteers joining campaigns in East Africa and Europe, despite internal political divisions that remained since the Boer War. South African troops played a key role in the conquest of German colonies in Africa, extending the battlefield across continents, and reminding the world that this was truly a global conflict in the United States. However, the stance of neutrality continued to face internal pressure. German U-boat attacks on Allied shipping, including American vessels, stoked outrage, and the infamous sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, though not enough to draw the U.S. into war, marked the beginning of a shift. American sympathy leaned increasingly towards the Allies, and its booming industrial sector became the arsenal of democracy, feeding the British and French war machines with weapons, ammunition, and supplies for the English-speaking nations. The war had become more than an imperial struggle. It had evolved into a defining confrontation of values, of civilization against militarism, of freedom against autocracy, and the youth of these nations bore its weight in blood as generals planned new offensives and politicians debated strategy. The men in the trenches dug deeper, fought harder, and endured longer, marking a generation with scars both visible and unseen. By the dawn of 1917, the war had drained the strength of nations, but the fire still raged on all fronts. The English-speaking world now found itself at a pivotal moment in the conflict, a time when unity, innovation, and sacrifice would begin to tilt the balance of power. The entry of the United States into the war would become the most defining shift of the year. On April 6th, the American Congress declared war on Germany after a string of provocations, including the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, and the infamous Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany urged Mexico to join the war against the United States. This declaration marked the beginning of a new era for America, which until then had maintained its neutrality, though its industries had heavily supported the Allies. American soldiers known as doughboys began preparing to cross the Atlantic in vast numbers, while at home the country mobilized its economy, passed the Selective Service Act, and began constructing the infrastructure needed for a total war effort. The psychological impact on the Allies was immediate. They saw in the United States a vast, untapped reservoir of manpower, industry, and morale. Canada, meanwhile, had reached a boiling point of its own. The Battle of Vimy Ridge, fought in April of the same year, became a national crucible. Canadian divisions fought together under Canadian command for the first time, led by General Arthur Currie. Their assault on the heavily fortified German positions was precise, well planned, and successful. They captured the ridge in days, a feat the French and British had failed to accomplish for years. It was a triumph paid in blood with nearly 11,000 casualties, but it forged a national identity. Canadians saw themselves no longer as mere subjects of the British Empire, but as a proud people with their own legacy and leadership. Vimy Ridge became a symbol of Canadian determination, skill, and independence in Australia and New Zealand. The losses of Gallipoli and the Western Front continued to weigh heavily, but the Anzac spirit remained unbroken. Reinforcements continued to arrive in Europe, and the battles of Passchendaele and Bullecourt tested them further. The mud of Passchendaele swallowed men, horses, and dreams, yet the Australians pushed through, capturing key objectives, though at enormous cost. New Zealand troops fought with equal valor, especially in the Battle of Messines, where a massive underground mine detonation devastated German lines and allowed the Allies to seize the high ground. The English-speaking forces were becoming the backbone of many major operations, and their contributions could no longer be seen as secondary or symbolic. These were essential forces bearing equal burdens and earning equal honors. Back in Britain, conscription had been introduced, and the nation was fully invested in the war. Every town and village sent sons to the trenches, while women took over roles in agriculture, engineering, and medicine to keep the country afloat. The Royal Flying Corps expanded dramatically, bringing air combat to the forefront, with daring pilots like Canadian ace Billy Bishop achieving legendary status. Even as the death toll mounted, the spirit of these nations refused to collapse. In South Africa, soldiers continued to serve in Europe and Africa, though internal racial divisions limited the full inclusion of all citizens. The war, however, sparked discussions that would later evolve into greater movements for equality and recognition for marginalized communities across all English-speaking nations. The war effort had ignited social change that could not be reversed. The economies of the English-speaking world had shifted irreversibly. Factories once making cars or clothing now produced shells, guns, and aircraft. Agriculture was mechanized, and rationing became a daily reality. Public opinion was managed through propaganda films, speeches, and posters, urging civilians to support the war by any means possible, and they did, with war bonds, volunteer nursing, and tireless labor. But as the Allies pushed forward, Germany too escalated its efforts. The spring offensive of 1918, launched by Germany, was a desperate gamble to win the war before American troops could fully arrive. It was the largest offensive since the early days of the war, and it tore into British and French lines. The English-speaking divisions bore the brunt of the attack, holding positions under unimaginable pressure, retreating only when necessary, and counterattacking with ferocity. The Canadian and Australian forces, in particular, played crucial roles in halting the German advance. Their battlefield experience, their cohesion, and their unyielding spirit helped plug the gaps when the line threatened to break. And in that darkest moment of the war, the tide began to turn. American troops arrived in growing numbers, bringing fresh strength and morale with them. Their presence changed the dynamics of the battlefield and provided a powerful boost to the exhausted Allies. By the middle of 1918, the 100 Days Offensive began, and the combined might of British, Canadian, Australian, American, and French forces began to push the Germans back, one brutal mile at a time. Amiens, Arras, Cambrai. These names became the markers of a relentless Allied surge towards victory. The English-speaking nations had become the sword and shield of the Western Front, leading coordinated offensives, using new tactics, integrating air support and armored vehicles, and reclaiming occupied territory with unwavering momentum. Every village liberated, every trench retaken came at a price. But the end was now within sight, and the sacrifices of the English-speaking nations had become the foundation upon which that hope rested. As the leaves turned in autumn, the world prepared for the possibility that the war might finally end, and the role of these nations would be carved into history, not just through their battlefield achievements, but through their unity, resilience, and the seeds of transformation they had sown across the globe. As the autumn of 1918 unfolded, the battlefields of Europe trembled beneath the relentless advance of Allied forces. The English-speaking nations now stood at the very heart of the final offensive. After more than 4 years of attrition and agony, their perseverance was about to bear fruit. The 100 Days Offensive was a coordinated series of rapid assaults that broke the German lines from Amiens to Mons. British, Canadian, Australian, and American forces advanced in unison, exploiting weaknesses with precision and fury. Canadian troops played a decisive role in capturing key positions during the Battle of Amiens. Their swift and strategic attack shattered enemy morale and was described by General Ludendorff as the Black Day of the German Army. Australians followed with critical victories in Mont-Saint-Quentin and Péronne, displaying their trademark aggression and tactical brilliance. American soldiers surged through the Meuse-Argonne region, fighting fiercely and proving themselves in some of the bloodiest battles of the war. Their arrival had tilted the scales. Their energy and numbers infused the weary Allies with renewed determination, while the Germans faced internal collapse. Their people starving their soldiers exhausted their allies, defecting the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, and Austria. Hungary began to crumble one by one, and within Germany, civil unrest grew louder. Revolution brewed in the streets, and the Kaiser's rule wavered. By November, the writing was on the wall, and the war that had consumed a generation was finally staggering to its end. But the victory was not merely one of weapons and maneuvers. It was a triumph of unity and will. The English-speaking nations had marched through fire together, sharing rations, trenches, and nightmares. Their blood mingled in the mud of France. Their friendships forged in foxholes, transcended borders, and transformed identities in Canada. The war had created a sense of sovereign pride. Canadian troops had fought as a unified force under Canadian leadership, and their valor had demanded a place on the world stage in Australia and New Zealand. The Anzac legacy had become a national story. Their sacrifices at Gallipoli and the Western Front etched into the soul of their societies. As both tragedy and inspiration in South Africa, the war exposed the fractures of colonial rule, but also planted the seeds of future struggle for inclusion and identity for Britain. The cost was immense: over 1 million dead and a shattered economy. But the empire had stood its ground. Its people had endured the unimaginable and emerged forever changed. And for the United States, the war had been a coming of age. It had entered late, but decisively, its economic and military power now undeniable, and its voice on the global stage unignorable. President Woodrow Wilson arrived in Europe as a symbol of peace and principle, proposing his 14 points and envisioning a new world order where nations would settle disputes not with arms, but with dialogue and diplomacy. On November 11, 1918, the guns finally fell silent. The armistice was signed and a stunned world exhaled. The war to end. All wars had ended, but at what cost? More than 16 million dead, over 20 million wounded, countless lives and landscapes shattered, entire empires dissolved, and a generation marked by trauma and loss. The peace that followed would be uneasy, filled with compromises, bitterness, and the seeds of future conflict. But for that moment, as church bells rang and flags were raised, the English-speaking nations stood among the victors, not just of battlefields, but of belief. They had stood for justice, unity, and the defense of a world threatened by tyranny. And in their shared sacrifice, they had discovered new strength, new voices, and new visions for the future. They would shape the peace. They would bear the burdens of the dead, and they would carry the lessons learned in blood into the uncertain dawn of a new century. The war had forged alliances, identities, and memories that would echo for generations to come. And the role played by these nations would never be forgotten. They had answered the call not for conquest but for conviction, and in doing so, they had helped to change the world. The guns fell silent on November 11, 1918. But the echoes of the Great War would reverberate through time, reshaping nations, redrawing borders, and redefining what it meant to be an English-speaking power in a fractured world. The role played by Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and South Africa was not just pivotal in securing military victory, but in forging the post-war identity of the 20th century. Britain emerged victorious but wounded beneath the Union. The cost was staggering in lives lost in youth, erased, and in an empire that had begun to strain under the weight of its own contradictions. Soldiers returning home were no longer boys of the empire. They were men forged in agony, unwilling to return to silent subservience. The working class demanded rights. The suffragettes demanded votes. and the empire itself began to crack as whispers of independence stirred in India, Ireland, and beyond Canada returned from war no longer a colony in spirit, but a nation that had bled for itself, not merely for the crown. Vimy Ridge had become its altar of sacrifice, and its veterans returned home demanding recognition reforms and a stronger voice in the affairs of the world. Canada would gain a separate signature on the Treaty of Versailles, a powerful symbol of its growing autonomy in Australia and New Zealand. The war had imprinted itself upon the soul of the people. Anzac Day became more than a commemoration. It became a cornerstone of national identity, the sorrow of Gallipoli, the courage of the Western Front, and the shared grief of a generation lost bound communities together across vast distances. Mothers who once waved farewell to boys at Sydney Harbor or Wellington Port now stood at memorials, reading names carved into stone live, taken in a war fought across the globe, yet carried forever in the hearts of the home front. South Africa emerged with pride and pain. Its troops had served honorably in Europe and Africa, but the divides within its society remained stark. The war had exposed the limits of unity within its borders, and in the decades to follow that tension would only grow. Yet its role in the conflict was undeniable. It had stood with the Allies, borne its share of the burden, and begun to shape its identity through both military service and political awakening. And then there was the United States, once an isolated observer. Now a global force, its economy surged, its culture expanded, its ideals broadcast across oceans. President Wilson's dream of a League of Nations was born from the crucible of the war, even though America would later reject it. The war marked the true beginning of American influence on the global stage. The Doughboys had marched into history, and with them came a nation no longer content to remain on the sidelines. The post-war period, however, was not only about glory, it was about reckoning. English-speaking veterans returned home with scars, visible and invisible shell shock, what we now call PTSD, haunted their nights. Unemployment, hardship, and broken promises greeted many of those who had given everything for a cause that now felt distant. Disillusionment gave birth to literature, music, art, and social change. The war poets, the jazz age, the lost generation all rose from the soil watered with blood and grief. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, aimed to cement peace, but instead planted resentment. Its harsh terms, especially upon Germany, sowed the seeds for another far deadlier conflict to come, the war to end. All wars did not end all wars, but it did mark the end of innocence and the beginning of modernity. For the English-speaking nations, the lessons of unity, sacrifice, and the high cost of hubris were seared into their cultural memory. For the first time, their soldiers had fought not just for empire, but for each other, for the belief that their voices mattered, for the hope that a better world could be born from the ashes of the old. And so monuments rose across fields and cities. Names etched into stone songs sung each November, tales passed down not of conquest, but of courage. The war had ended, but its legacy endured in every flag, raised every peace, kept every voice demanding a future shaped by the memory of those who had fallen. The role of English-speaking nations in World War I was not just about battles fought or territories gained, it was about transformation. The birth of new identities, the forging of nations, and the unyielding hope that even after darkness, light could return.